The woman on the depot platform was not who the letters had described. She stood apart from the other arrivals, a brown carpetbag at her feet with a brass clasp missing one tooth, wearing a blue Sunday dress taken in at the waist and shortened at the hem that still pulled wrong across the shoulders. Her hands, wrapped around the carpetbag handle, showed the roughness of someone who had kept house for others long enough that the work had settled into the skin. When the depot master called the Redstone flat stage, she picked up the bag without hesitating and did not look around for anyone to tell her it was all right. Her name was Ruth Calloway, the name she had given the agency in St. Louis, the name on the correspondence, the name she had signed to 7 months of letters, was Clara. What she had done was plain enough to say. Her sister Clara had spent 7 months riding to a widowed Colorado rancher named Elias Horne, then married a traveling salesman from Memphis 2 weeks before she was due to leave. Clara had handed Ruth the letter bundle tied with kitchen string and said, "He needs someone, and so do you," and walked away. Ruth was 31 years old, a schoolteacher. She had read every letter Elias Horne had written, thought about it for one night, and then wrote back and said she was coming. If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if a woman in your family came west with nothing and built a home, share her name in the comments. I read every one. The wagon from the Horne Ranch arrived 20 minutes after the stage, driven by a hand named Pete who had a white scar through his left eyebrow and no interest in small talk. He loaded the carpetbag without ceremony and drove, without speaking, for the better part of an hour. Ruth spent the time going through what she remembered of Clara's letters. The land was drier than she had imagined, red rock pushing up through the scrub to the west, the sky the particular deep blue of high country in late October. The ranch appeared at the base of a mesa fringed with juniper. The main house was squared log and river stone, a covered porch running across the front. The barn to the east was longer than the house and better kept. Chickens moved through the yard. A milk cow stood at the fence rail, watching the wagon come in, with the patience of something that has seen a great deal and been moved by none of it. Elias Horne was on the porch. He was taller than Ruth had expected from the letters, leaned through the shoulders in the way of men who work outdoors their whole lives, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and a watchful face that held nothing unnecessary. He was not smiling. He was looking at her with the expression of a man checking what he received against what he had expected, and finding the columns did not match. Ruth stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help. "Mr. Horne, I'm Clara Calloway. I'm sorry if I'm not quite what you pictured." He came down the porch steps and shook her hand. "You're welcome here, Miss Calloway." His voice was measured, neither warm nor cold. His eyes said something different. She had prepared for that look. What she had not prepared for was the girl. The child appeared at Elias's elbow, so silently that Ruth had not seen her come from the house. 7 years old or close to it, with her father's dark, watchful eyes and a face still round with childhood, wearing a brown dress and a white apron. She studied Ruth the way you study something you have already made up your mind about. "You don't look like what Papa's letter sounded like," the girl said. "Nora," Elias said, with the flatness of a man who has said a name in that particular tone many times. "I'm Ruth," Ruth said, before she could stop herself. She caught the word and covered. "Forgive me. Nora is a good name. I'm Clara. It's been a long journey." The girl looked at her. "You said Ruth. A slip. My grandmother's name. It comes out sometimes." Nora did not argue, but she kept watching. Inside the house, Ruth met Dora. Elias's older sister had run the Horne house since his wife Agnes died 3 years before. Dora was 43, unmarried, and had organized her life around the kind of necessity that comes from being the one person a household cannot do without. She took Ruth's coat with a careful smile and offered coffee and a direct observation. Elias's letters described someone quite different from what Clara's correspondence had led me to expect. "I look different than my writing," Ruth said. Evidently, the kitchen was the first test and the first relief. Ruth had cooked in boarding houses and school kitchens and her mother's farmhouse for 15 years, and she read a kitchen the way she read a classroom, noting what worked and what had been done by habit rather than care. She saw the sourdough starter on a back shelf that needed feeding, the cracked handle on the cast iron pot, the wood pile standing too low. That evening she made a beef stew with parsnips from the root cellar and a loaf of bread with the starter. Dried blue sage worked into the dough the way her mother had done every September. Elias ate without speaking. His son Thomas sat at the end of the bench, coughing into his sleeve between bites, pale and smaller than a 5-year-old should look. Dora said the cough had settled in the boy's chest since September, and that mustard plasters, honey syrup, and the patent remedy from the general store in Redstone Flats had none of them shifted it. Ruth gave Thomas an extra portion of broth and watched his small shoulders ease. She said nothing about the cough that night. Dora ate 2 full portions of the bread. She said nothing about that either. The first week went forward in the way first weeks go. When you're learning something, you cannot be taught all at once. Ruth was up before the stove each morning. She learned the kitchen shelf by shelf, rule by rule, without asking about the logic behind each one, because there was no answer to that question that would be welcome, and she did not need one. The mending pile on the parlor chair, she cleared 2 items at a time in the evenings after supper, after the children had gone up, replacing buttons and resetting hems, and patching one pair of Thomas's trousers so carefully that the repair held and almost did not show. Dora found the trousers in the clean laundry on Tuesday and set them on the chair without a word. Ruth took the silence as the kind of acknowledgement a woman like Dora would give to work that needed no praise, because the work itself was the thing. The first week went by in the work of learning a house that was not hers. Ruth was up before the stove was lit each morning, seeing to the things she had noted needed doing. The chicken water that froze overnight, the mending pile on the parlor chair grown high enough to topple. The corn mush Dora had been making every day out of habit when there was good flour in the bin and a starter worth using. She did these things without commenting on them and without drawing attention to the fact that she was doing them. She did not ask to be thanked, and she did not wait to be told she had done well. Elias noticed. She could tell by the small shift in his manner each morning, a fraction warmer than the day before, the kind of change in a person who has been proved wrong about something and is deciding what to make of it. On the 5th morning, he stopped at the kitchen doorway before going out and said only, "The bread keeps better than anything we've had here in years." Then he went to the barn. Dora, standing at the dry sink, heard it and said nothing. But Ruth saw her hands stop moving for a moment on the pot she was washing. Dora watched all of this with the calculation of a woman who knows a household to the bone. She did not give praise, and she did not give criticism. She watched the way Ruth's hands moved on the bread, the way she organized the spice shelf, the way she gave Thomas his remedy without fuss or ceremony, and she held her own counsel. But twice in that first week, she asked questions that had nothing to do with housekeeping. Where had Ruth learned about wild ginger, and whether the McGuffey third reader was too advanced for a 7-year-old who read fast but understood slowly? Ruth answered both plainly. One afternoon, Dora came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway, watching Ruth feed the sourdough starter. She watched for a full minute. Then she said, "You were not here 2 weeks ago. You don't know that starter's character yet." Ruth agreed that she didn't. Dora crossed the room and showed her how the starter pulled away from the spoon when it was ready, a motion you had to feel rather than see, and she showed it without warmth but without contempt, the way you hand a tool to someone who will be using it whether or not you approve of them. For Thomas's cough, Ruth waited until the end of the first week. A farm neighbor back home, a woman who had kept 7 children through hard winters on nothing but dried herbs and stubbornness, had taught her a remedy for chest colds that refused to move. Ruth spent an afternoon in the hills above the ranch, gathering yarrow and the gray-leafed wild ginger that grew along the drainage ditch. She made a broth that evening strong enough to smell through closed doors and brought it to Thomas in his bedroom, while Dora watched from the doorway. Ruth pressed the warm, herb-soaked cloth to the boy's chest and talked to him about the horses and what Pete had been doing in the barn that day, keeping him still without ordering him to be still. Dora stood in the doorway through the whole of it and said only, "That's unusual," and then went to make her own supper without further comment. Give him 3 days, Ruth had said. By the 3rd morning, the cough had loosened. By the end of the week, Thomas was running in the yard chasing the milk cow's calf, hollering at it to give back his hat. At supper, Elias looked at Ruth and said, Without raising his eyes from the plate, "Thank you, Clara." He said the name with a small pause before it. The way a person says a word they are not certain is the right one. Ruth told herself the pause meant nothing. Nora was a different kind of test. She worked through her McGuffey third at the kitchen table every evening while Ruth washed up, and one night she pushed the reader across the table without a word. Ruth opened it to a passage about the habits of the honeybee and read it through. When she finished, Nora took the book back and was quiet for a moment. "You're a teacher," Nora said. "Or you were. What makes you say that?" "The way you read. You slow down on the hard words so a person can follow along. You don't do that when you're reading to yourself." Nora looked at the page. Clara's letters said she had been a companion to an elderly woman. Companions don't read like teachers. Ruth set down the pot she had been washing. "Your father thinks clearly," she said carefully. "He writes with purpose. That comes from somewhere. He taught himself from books." Nora closed the reader. "He doesn't have much patience for people who aren't honest with him." A pause, as though this were simply an observation about the weather. "I set a place at the supper table for you before Papa put the advertisement in the paper. I knew someone was coming who would stay." She picked up the reader. "I told Papa, and he said I was being peculiar." She said goodnight and went upstairs, leaving Ruth standing at the dry sink thinking about a 7-year-old who set a place at a table for an unnamed woman and then waited calmly to be proved right. One evening in the middle of the second week, Elias found her on the porch after supper, watching the last light leave the top of the mesa. The children were in bed. Dora had gone to her room. He came out and stood at the rail, and after a while said, "Agnes used to stand here in the evenings. I won't if you'd rather." "No, I don't mind." He looked at the dark shape of the rock above them. "The letters I received in March were particular in a way I did not expect. Most people writing to a matrimonial advertisement speak in general terms about themselves. Yours talked about learning to preserve from watching your mother fail at it twice first." He paused. "I thought that was an unusual thing to write to a stranger. Some people think the failures are more honest than the successes," Ruth said. "I've come to think the same." He was quiet for a while. A night bird started up in the juniper grove and went silent again. The children have been different this month. Nora reads her lesson without being pushed. Thomas finishes his plate and asks for more. He looked out at the dark valley. "Whatever else you brought into this house, you brought that." "Children settle when the house feels steady," Ruth said. "Yes, Agnes knew that. It took me 3 years to understand it was what had gone missing." He was quiet a moment longer. Then he went inside and left her alone on the porch. Ruth stood there looking at the stars coming up over the red rock and thought about letters tied with kitchen string and a sister who had walked away, and about whether the life you build from what remains can be as solid as the one you planned. She was beginning to believe it could. That was what she was afraid of. The sourdough starter sat on the back shelf in the dark kitchen behind her, doing the slow work it had been doing for 40 years. You could not rush it, and you could not ignore it. You fed it and kept it warm and gave it time. She thought about that for a while, then went to bed. If you're still with us on this porch, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments. Let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. The letter came 3 days later. Pete brought the mail from town on a Thursday morning and handed it to Dora at the kitchen door. Ruth was making the noon meal when Dora came into the kitchen and set an envelope on the table between them. She said nothing. The return address said C. Brennan, Nate Calloway, St. Louis, Missouri. The handwriting was Clara's. Ruth dried her hands. She looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she went out to the barn to find Elias. He was repairing a broken stall latch, focused on the work, and he looked up when she came in from the cold. She held the envelope out to him without explanation. "I think you should read it," she said, "and then I want to talk to you." He read it at the kitchen table after the noon meal, alone, while Dora stayed in the front room and the children were at their lessons. Ruth remained in the kitchen and washed the pots and did not listen for anything in particular, because she had already decided what she was going to say, and there was nothing useful in anticipating how it would be received. When he was done, he set the letter on the table and looked at her. She turned from the sink to face him. "My name is Ruth Calloway," she said. Clara is my sister. She wrote to you for 7 months and then chose someone else and asked me to take her place. I took the last month of correspondence in my own hand. I came here under her name." She stopped, then continued without softening it. "I should have told you the first day. I'm sorry I didn't." The kitchen was very still. From the front room, Dora could be heard turning the pages of her mending pattern, the sound of someone pressed against the other side of a wall. Elias said nothing for a moment. He looked at the letter and then at Ruth. "The sage bread," he said. She waited. Clara's letters described cooking in general terms. The letters from the last month went into particular detail. The blue sage, the way your mother taught you to fail at preserving twice before you learned it right. I have been trying since you arrived to understand why the woman in the later letters and the woman who stepped off the stage felt like the same person, when the earlier letters pointed somewhere different. The writing changed. The sentences became more careful about small things and less careful about protecting themselves. He turned the letter over in his hands. "I know now why that was. The first 6 months were Clara's," Ruth said. "The last month was mine. I tried to match her style." "You didn't quite." He set the letter down. "The later letters were more honest. That was how I knew something had changed, though I could not have told you what." He stood. He walked to the stove, opened the iron door, and dropped the letter through it. The paper caught at once and was gone in the space of a breath. Dora appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Ruth with an expression that had been gathering weight for 3 weeks and had now arrived in full. "You came into this house under a false name," she said. "Yes. You deceived my brother and this family." "Yes." The agreement left Dora without the argument she had come in carrying. She had prepared for excuses and explanations, for a woman who would justify herself. Ruth offered none of those things. She stood at the dry sink with level eyes and said yes and meant it and did not soften it. Nora appeared at Dora's elbow, barefoot on the cold floor. She had come down from her lesson room, which meant she had been listening longer than anyone knew. "I knew her name was Ruth from the first day," Nora said. She looked at her father. She said herself, "I didn't say anything because everything else she did here was the truth. The bread and Thomas's cough and the mending pile and the reading. All of it true." She looked at Dora and then at Ruth. Only the name was wrong. The fire made a small sound in the stove. Outside, one of the horses shifted in the corral. The 4 of them stood in the kitchen in a silence that was not easy, but was at least honest, and Ruth let it stay. She did not fill it with appeals or softening or anything that asked for more than she deserved. Elias looked at Dora. "Thomas is running in the yard again. The mending pile is gone. The starter that had been going wrong for 2 years is producing bread worth eating. My daughter set a place at this table for this woman before I placed the advertisement in any paper, and she has been telling me in her own way since the first day that she already knew who was coming." He let a moment pass. "Ruth came here under a false name. Everything else she has done in this house, she did with her own hands and her honest skill. I have watched her for 3 weeks, and I have not seen her behave dishonestly in any other matter, small or large." He looked at his sister steadily. "I'm not sending her away." Dora's face tightened. Then it eased in the way of someone who has argued the wrong thing and arrived at the understanding of it. She had been running this house out of love for her brother and something close to fear of being displaced, and this woman had come and done the work so plainly and so well that the only real complaint was a name. Dora had enough honesty to feel the weight of that, and she was, underneath the stiffness of her manner, a woman who valued honesty above most things. She looked at Ruth for a long time. "The sourdough," she said finally, her voice stiff but not unkind. "You've been using too much salt." "The starter is older than what I was used to," Ruth said. "It changes the balance. It's my mother's starter. She carried it west from Ohio 40 years ago. Then I'll learn to compensate." Dora looked at her a moment longer. Then she picked up her mending and went back to the front room. She did not close the door behind her. Nora crossed the floor barefoot and stopped in front of Ruth. "Are you staying?" she asked. Ruth looked at Elias, who had not moved from where he stood near the stove. "If I'm wanted," she said. "You've been wanted," he said, "since about the 3rd day, when Nora started setting your place at the table before I asked." Nora took Ruth's hand in both of hers and pulled her toward the stove, businesslike, as though the matter was settled and there was supper to think about. Ruth let herself be pulled. She looked back once at the stove where the letter had been, and there was nothing there now but a clean iron door. That evening the household was different, though no one announced it. Dora sat in her usual chair in the front room and did not go to bed early the way she sometimes did when the day had worn on her nerves. Thomas came to the kitchen doorway and asked if Ruth would read to him before sleeping, and she sat on the edge of his bed with the McGuffey third and read the honeybee passage in the slow, careful way Nora had noticed, letting him follow along until his eyes went heavy. Elias passed the doorway once, saw them there, and kept walking. But Ruth heard his footsteps stop for a moment and then continue on, and that was enough. The days that followed settled into something no one named out loud, because naming it too soon would have been the wrong kind of haste. Dora did not warm at once, but she moved differently through the kitchen, less like a sentry and more like a woman who had made up her mind about something and was getting used to the shape of it. She asked Ruth twice in the same week to pass things she could have reached herself, which meant she was choosing to stand closer. Ruth noticed and said nothing. 3 days after that, Dora asked without preamble whether Ruth thought the starter might do better with a small amount of rye flour worked into the feed. Ruth said she thought it might. They spent an afternoon testing it over a batch of trial loaves, the kitchen filling with the smell of warm bread and early winter wood smoke. Neither of them mentioned the letter or the doorway or the things said on Thursday. Some things settle by being lived past rather than talked through, and both women understood that well enough to let it happen. Ruth began to understand, in those November weeks, what it meant to be suited to a place rather than merely capable of it. There was a difference she had not fully grasped before. You could be capable through skill and willingness and the determination to do what needed doing. Being suited was a different thing. It meant that when you stood in the kitchen in the early morning while the stove was coming up and the light came in low over the mesa and the starter was doing its slow work on the back shelf, you did not feel like a person filling a space that belonged to someone else. You felt like a person standing in the place they were supposed to stand. She could not have said when exactly that shift had happened. She thought it might have happened before she arrived, which was not something she was prepared to examine too closely. What she knew was that it had happened, and that it was enough. The week before Christmas, Elias asked Ruth to walk with him to the upper fence line to check a gate that kept coming loose from its post. The gate was perfectly sound. They stood in the cold with their breath in the air, looking out at the valley spread below the ranch, the far peaks holding snow, the sky thin and pale at the horizon. "I want to be honest with you," he said. Ruth said she wished he would be. I placed that advertisement because Nora had been setting a fifth place at the supper table for 2 months for a person who wasn't there. She told me a woman was coming who would stay, and I thought she was being peculiar the way children are peculiar when grief has left them with too many unanswered things. He looked at the valley. What I received was entirely different from what I expected. I expected someone who fit where Agnes had been. What I got was someone who made this house work the way it hadn't worked in 3 years, and then made it work better. He paused. "I want you to know that is not a small thing to me. I want you to know it plainly and not as a courtesy." "I understand," Ruth said, "and I want you to know something plainly in return. I came here in my sister's name, but I came here with my own intentions. Everything I have done in that house I did because I believe it was worth doing, not because I was trying to earn my way past a mistake." She looked at the mountains. "I'm not going to apologize for who I am, only for the name I used to get here." He looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the valley. "Fair enough," he said. The snow on the high peaks was blue in the December light, the real blue you only see in country this far from anywhere else. "My grandmother was Ruth Calloway," she said. "She came west from Ohio when she was 22, with a husband who died on the road and a trunk that outlasted him by 30 years. She built a farm from what remained. She always said the right life is not always the first offer. Sometimes it is the one you build from what is left after the first offer fails." "She sounds like she knew something," Elias said. She knew more than she ever said. They stood looking at the valley for a while, the cold air around them unhurried. Then they walked back together toward the ranch. The smoke from the kitchen chimney rose straight and still in the windless air. Nora was in the yard chasing the milk cow's calf, which had gotten through the fence again. Thomas was on the porch with his hat on, calling instructions that the calf ignored completely. When Thomas saw Ruth and Elias coming down the hill, he waved with his whole arm the way small children wave when they are absolutely certain of being seen. Ruth watched her children, because that was what they were becoming, and thought about a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string and a sister who had said, "He needs someone, and so do you," and walked away. She thought about 7 months of reading someone else's correspondence, and the 1 month she had written herself, honest in everything except the name. The house was warm when they came inside. Dora had the kettle on. The smell of morning's bread still hung in the air, rye flour in the dough now, the rise a little higher than last week. Nora came in red-cheeked from the calf chase and went to the basin without being reminded. Thomas pulled his boots off at the back door, which was not yet a habit, but was beginning to be one. Ruth tied on her apron and started the midday meal. The sourdough starter sat on the back shelf. 40 years. Ohio. An ordinary life, carried west, and kept alive and handed on. She looked at it and thought, yes, that was how it was done. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen. Go get a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join the porch. We're telling stories about women who carried more than the world ever knew. See you in the next one.